How are you going? Boss man Swamp Wallaby? I see you got over whatever chest infection you had a couple of weeks ago. All the Swamp Wallabies got over it. Yes, that's good. That's good. Well, we'll see how we go with this Horseshoe-Bat's revenge, which has been let loose onto my species. But there's a lot of humans are getting very scared, you see, Ericsson clip here. As long as I can buy bread in the bakery or the supermarket, the marsupial restaurant will remain open. The water dishes will be cleaned and filled, even if I have no bread for you. We're living in interesting times, Ericsson clip here. We're undergoing the largest reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions since the Soviet Union imploded. Cargo shipping contracted when China shut down. Now airlines have shut down. Sport, fashion, tourism, gourmet restaurants and all sit-down restaurants, pubs, casinos, gambling, theatres, concerts, movie theatres. Whole countries are being told to stay inside their houses for the next 3 weeks. In Italy, the people on the wards are no longer bothering to count the dead, although in the last 24 hours, Italy had slightly less deaths than they had the previous 24 hours. It's a strange thing, but the people who die today are the people who've been in hospital very sick for the past 3 weeks. So if you want to get an accurate idea of what the death rate is with novel coronavirus 2019, COVID-19, take the absolute death toll today and divide that not into today's number of known cases, divide that into the number of known cases 2 or 3 weeks ago. And that'll explain why everything that all the governments are doing is too late. The fact that New South Wales had 170 cases diagnosed yesterday. That means that 3 weeks ago, those people were exposed to the virus. In 3 weeks, some of them who get sick enough who've gone to hospital, if there's a hospital bed, some of them will recover and some of them will die. I think 62 or 64% of the people who need hospital treatment are over the age of 55. About 62 or 64% of the people who need the hospital treatment are men. Nobody under the age of 9 has died. Only one person between 10 and 19 has died. The reason in Italy they won't hospitalise anybody over 60 with coronavirus is because, come on, all their intensive care beds are full of 20, 30, 40, 50-year-olds. And if you've got hypertension or diabetes, yeah. Strange how sensitive he is to me thinking or talking about death rates. The figure I've really paid attention to is that in the first town in Italy where they had 3,700 people, the first town where the first person in all of Italy was tested positive, they locked down the whole town, they tested the whole town, they got 89 or 87 positive test results from 89 or 87 people who had no signs or symptoms. So there's a 2.3% occult contagion rate before you get your first case showing up and presenting at the doctor with flu-like symptoms. Which means, as I said to the Mayor of Glen Innes yesterday, by the time Glen Innes, with 10,000 people in the municipality and the surrounding shire, by the time we get the first person presenting, there's going to be 230 cases who've been shedding fomates, which are viable contagious virus droplets, for probably a week and a half before that first case shows up. So yeah, it's understandable in that light, the reactions that various governments are taking. It's understandable that Britain's got to stay inside for 3 weeks. One of the exceptions, as I understand it, to these lockdown conditions when they tend to come in is that if you've got to travel to look after family members, you can do that. That'll be good because I'm 20 kilometres away from my aged mother. And her firewood needs to be chopped and carted because we're going into winter. That brings me to another point. With all the turn down in international shipping, that means a turn down in the number of maritime generated condensation trails from the exhaust of all the cargo ships. With the complete cessation of airline transport, that means there's no more contrails being generated in the sky. And condensation trails, whether at low level or at high level, they have fluffy white reflective tops on them. After 9/11, 2001, 19 years ago, when they shut down all airlines in America for 3 days or a week, because there were less jets, because there were no jets, there were no contrails. Because there were no contrails, there was less cloud cover. Because there was less cloud cover, the albedo or reflecting power of planet Earth over America dropped. And for the duration of the airline shutdown, the temperature rose. I think it was something like 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, so maybe a third of a degree Celsius. So, Northern Hemisphere, going into summer, Europe just had the hottest winter they've ever had. Four degrees above baseline average Celsius. If they're now going into summer and there's going to be no contrails to block the sunlight, if their winter was 4 degrees above baseline average, they might get another couple of degrees on top of that from the lack of contrail effect. In fact, it may be as much as 3 or 4 degrees on top of that. So poor buggers are going to be locked inside, sick, dying or scared, bored, cranky, and they're going to be facing record temperatures. If the airlines are shut down, is there anybody going to be around to maintain and operate large air tankers? As I said to my son just before Christmas, when word of the Wuhan Horseshoe-Bat virus revenge first started to appear in New Scientist magazine, I said to him, if the airlines bring that bloody thing here and we get a new flu sweeping through Australia while the megafires are on, we are up shit creek, because I just can't see how you can fight a fire when you got the flu. And the Northern Hemisphere is going into summer, locked down. And I suppose, as it could have been predicted, the Americans have had a bit of a rush on the gun shops, sold themselves out of all kinds of guns and ammunition. One of my subscribers either had or almost had a fight in the car park of the supermarket because somebody was abusing him for the quantity of coffee filter papers, potato chips, and carbonated fizzy drink that he had in his shopping trolley. And he wasn't armed at the time, so he de-escalated and talked his way out of it, but he says he's going to start carrying a gun, and so is his wife, in the future because things are getting crazy. So yeah, and adding to all this, the idea that the American White House appears to be flirting with the concept that the economic consequences of shutting down everything in order to try and stop the virus is going to be far worse than the consequences of just letting the virus rip through society and bury the people who die and get on with going to the football afterwards, as well as during. He may decide to make it an act of patriotism to cluster in public places and cheer for him at the rally. So the times they are changing. The times they are changing. Interesting times. It's almost, but not quite, parallel to the scenario as described in a science fiction story first published in about 1901 or something, perhaps 1903. It's called The Scarlet Plague by L. Sprague de Camp. And it's told from the point of view of a survivor of the plague who used to be a university professor of English literature, or perhaps it was history, trying to explain life the way it used to be to his grandchildren. And they're essentially living a not quite Stone Age cave dweller existence. It was written so far back, the author did not envisage heavier than air aircraft, although passenger airships formed part of the word picture of the society which fell to pieces. Maybe it's a case of be careful what you wish or pray for, because you're almost certain to get it. Maybe humans have been wishing and praying for some kind of a pestilential collapse to bring an end to the quest for ever more production of bright and shiny landfill. Maybe we've been expecting something like this, but it certainly seems to be happening around and about. Roughly now, because the 170 cases that happened or were diagnosed in New South Wales overnight, they got infected 3 weeks ago, and they've spent the last 3 weeks running around, interacting, leaving droplets behind them. To all of those people who said that they wanted to play a game and they guessed that when they wait till December and see the after figures looking backwards through the retrospectoscope, they're guessing, they're planning, they're hoping that the novel coronavirus 2019 is going to turn out to be no worse than a severe flu. I think it's going to be a lot more severe than that. Last I heard, Italy's death rate was over 8% of the diagnosed cases. And like I said, the 8% that are dead today, they became infected 3 weeks ago. Well, actually, they became sick 3 weeks ago. It takes them about 3 weeks to die, maybe 11 days. I could go and dig out figures from a New Scientist article, 14th of March. Perhaps that'll be more authoritative than rattling shit off the top of my head and maybe plucking it out of my bum on the way. 14th of the March, I got that number right. This really is nothing like flu. Well, I got that right. Italy in lockdown. Well, it looks like they didn't lock down hard enough or fast enough, eh? Major testing issues in the US? Well, there still are. Why the death rate's so hard to pin down? I guess would be they're not testing. That's why the number of cases in Africa appeared to remain low. Same Indonesia, actually. And I think India as well. Anyway, here we go. Age, diabetes and heart disease linked to risk of death. 2 small studies this week shed light on who may be most at risk of dying from COVID-19 and how long it takes to develop symptoms. Early on in the outbreak, 2 hospitals in Wuhan, China were designated to treat people with the coronavirus. Bin Cao at Capital Medical University in Beijing and his colleagues have assessed all patients who had been discharged from or died at the hospitals by the 31st of January. So they're not assessing the people who are still undergoing treatment. They're only assessing the people who have been discharged, healthy, or have been sent to the daisy pushing brigade. They found that the average age was 56. Age of the dead on average, 56. Gulp, says the 59-year-old. 62% were men. Around half of those treated had underlying medical conditions, most often diabetes and high blood pressure, so says the Lancet. The average time from the onset of illness to discharge was 22 days. Don't tell you the average time from the onset of illness to the onset of death. Of the 191 people treated, 54 died, on average 18 days after symptoms began. Oopsie, I lied. There you see it, the perils of half reading while skimming. Let's go again. The average time from the onset of illness to discharge was 22 days. Of the 191 people treated, 54 died, slightly over 30%. On average, 18.5 days after the symptoms begin. Okay, so it takes longer to recover than it does to die. Death was more likely in older people and those with diabetes or coronary heart disease. Poorer outcomes in older people may be due in part to the age-related weakening of the immune system and the increased inflammation that could promote viral replication and more prolonged responses to inflammation. Weakening of the system with increased inflammation. I would have thought inflammation had ramped the system up, but anyway, I suppose it's like getting a small engine and trying to get maximum throttle out of it. Said co-author Jibo Liu at Jinyintan Hospital, one of the designated hospitals. A different study of 181 cases of COVID-19 covered in news reports, public health reports, and press releases has found that 97.5% of those who develop symptoms do so within 11.5 days of infection. This suggests that 14-day quarantines will miss only about 1% of cases. Half of those who show symptoms start to do so within the first 5.1 days. Yeah, and then there's that person who developed symptoms 28 days after they last had contact with anybody who was known to have the virus. So there's a pretty long rat's tail there. I'm going to say that the people who are presenting today, they got infected 2 to 3 weeks ago. But it may be 1 to 4 weeks. Therefore, thus and because my state premier's response of tightening restrictions now because last night's figures were up, yeah, it's great. But to be effective, all of this should have happened at the end of February, if not sooner. And at the end of February, nobody could convince the Chamber of Commerce and the tourist industry spokespeople, the Rugby Football League and the Australian Football League, the Olympics Committee, the airlines, nobody could convince those people that this is actually serious and you cannot continue with business as usual. So, yeah, they're shut down. And like I said, as a result of the Wuhan Horseshoe-Bat virus, the Wuhan Horseshoe-Bat's revenge, because it didn't like being treated as a delicacy at a meat market among other wildlife treated as livestock. It's certainly done a whole lot more damage to the human race than the Congolese fruit bat who put out bat eaters' revenge in Africa. We live in interesting times. And I got a ringside seat. I think a lot of the people I know have got ringside seats. Great minds think alike. When it's steamboat time, people build steamboats. When it's aeroplane time, people build aeroplanes. When it's social collapse time, people start prepping. The Cold War was a good cue, as far as I was concerned. If 3.5 billion people decided their national honour required them to drop thermonuclear weapons on strangers they'd never met in another country, and if they were going to do that on the other side of the world and tear down civilization and perhaps the fabric of life, the ability to remain alive, mosquitoes. It's rained. The forest's a swamp. Mosquitoes. Then I figured that one owed it to one's DNA, which had remained alive for millions of years, to attempt to survive whatever the rest of humanity wanted to do to itself. Therefore, prepping has always been one of the more sensible options, because if the shit hits the fan and you've prepped even a little bit, you're going to be better off than if you haven't prepped at all. And if you grow up faced with thermonuclear warfare, multi-sided, you'd have to have a death wish not to prep. Part of World War III was going to be bacterial warfare, bacteriological warfare, NBC, nuclear, biological, chemical battlefield. So a virus has always been on the cards, especially as the 1918, 1919 PUO, pyrexia of unknown origin. And as I said, our science fiction writers have been dreaming up this stuff since 1901 at least. The Scarlet Plague, L. Sprague de Camp. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Keep on keeping on. Keep your distance from everyone and stay safe. Ciao.